So I'm thrilled tonight that we have Dan Garodnick, our Director of City Planning and the Chair of the City Planning Commission, with us tonight to say a few words about the City of Yes. Dan?
Thanks, Lara, and good evening, everybody. I wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. And I understand that we have a record number of attendees for a virtual information session. Super impressive. It is great to see so many people taking an interest in our City of Yes for Housing Opportunity proposal. So thank you. If I may, I just wanted to start by acknowledging for a moment why we are having this conversation and why it is so important today. As you all know, there's a lot of discussion in political and policy circles that New York has a dire housing crisis driven by a decades-long housing shortage. And that certainly bears out in the statistics that we see. Over the past decade, we created about 800,000 jobs, but only 200,000 homes. The vacancy rate for apartments under $1,500 a month is functionally zero. In the last 40 years, we gained a population of 1.7 million people. We created housing at half the rate as we did in the prior 40 years when we actually lost population. It all adds up. It is cumulative. They aren't just numbers. This shortage has created real human challenges that are affecting all of our lives. Renters in New York City, they are getting squeezed badly. Over 50% of New Yorkers are rent burdened, which means that they pay more than 30% of their income in rent. And in some neighborhoods like Mott Haven or Bedford Park in the Bronx, Flushing, Jackson Heights, or East Elmhurst in Queens, Coney Island, Borough Park, Brooklyn, and the North Shore of Staten Island, and many more neighborhoods around the city, the percentage of people who are rent burdened is even significantly higher than that. Because of the cost of housing, too many New Yorkers are struggling today. There is also a dramatic imbalance in power between landlords and tenants in New York City. Without a credible option to move to another unit, tenants who do not have other protections are frequently faced with unimaginable rent increases, poor housing quality, or even harassment. We also have seen significant gentrification pressure in certain neighborhoods. Last year, of our 59 community districts, 9 districts created as much housing as the other 50 combined. 9 created as much as the other 50. When entire areas of New York City are functionally shut off for housing creation, everyone gets hurt. And yes, even the people in those very areas. Homeowners in low density areas, well, they're stuck too. Layer upon layer of zoning rules have made so many of our 1 and 2 family homes out of compliance with zoning. Not a good result when you are applying for insurance, looking for city approval for modest changes in your house, or to move in an aging relative to live with you. It's time for us to eliminate some of these non-compliance headaches and give middle-class homeowners the opportunity to make better use of their own property. It's time for us to take action here to address this housing supply problem in all corners, creating opportunities near transit, in small town centers, in attics, through office conversions, incentivizing the creation of affordable housing, and by eliminating some critical conflicts between housing and parking. As you all probably know, last week, the mayor announced the details of this initiative. By making these small changes across a wide geography, citywide, this will amount to the biggest pro-housing initiative in the history of New York City zoning. And yet we will do it without dramatic change that is frequently feared by communities around the city. Now, let's just take a moment to talk about process here. Tonight's conversation represents a pretty significant departure from the way that the Department of City Planning has conducted business in the past. Tonight's information session is about 6 months ahead of the official public review timeline. There are fully 6 months before this will even land at the first community board or borough president. And we expect the city council to have it on their desks next fall. This is deliberate. These are important issues. They are complicated, and we want to take our time to be as transparent as possible, take your questions, take your input, and be thoughtful about it. Thank you, by the way, to the community boards who engaged on our first text amendment, City of Yes for carbon neutrality. And I will note that our second proposal for economic opportunity, designed to expand opportunities and to fill the vacant storefronts, is coming your way soon. Our housing proposal, which we're discussing tonight, is the third of 3 of these text amendments and the earliest stage of the process for this one. We will continue to share this information over the coming months with events like these, community events, online. We intend to be in all corners. We really appreciate your engagement at this early stage and ask that when you see this proposal, that you keep in mind the human costs of inaction here. We need to look to the next 60 years in New York City. We need a directional shift on housing in New York City for renters and homeowners alike. I want to encourage you to check out YesHousingOpportunity.nyc for more details, and you certainly should feel free to email housingopportunity@planning.nyc.gov at any point with questions. We are really happy to talk to you about all of these issues throughout the process, anything that doesn't come up this evening as well. So again, thank you for joining us. With that, I'm going to let the great city planning team get into the details. Lara, thanks for the opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you, Dan. Especially thank you to you for being with us tonight. So now we're going to jump into our slides. Like I mentioned before, you can use the Q&A function. I've already seen some questions starting to be put into the Q&A function. So we're very excited about that. And once we finish the presentation, I'll remind you the way that we'll be able to answer questions, and we'll be able to continue there. So I'm gonna now turn over to the Department of City Planning's housing team. We have Winnie Shen and Veronica Brown with us this evening, who are going to present on the topic at hand, the housing opportunity. And then again, after that, we will go into the Q&A portion of the evening. Winnie, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So we're excited to talk to everyone tonight about our City of Yes for housing opportunity, a citywide text amendment that would change zoning to allow for equitable housing development. And our proposals for this text amendment emerge from the goals outlined in the city's Fair Housing Plan, Where We Live NYC. Created by HPD in collaboration with over 250 community organizations, the plan highlights how the city's housing shortage and affordability crisis have severely limited New Yorkers' housing choices. New York City has seen tremendous job growth over the last 20 years, but housing production has not kept pace with the city's growing population. The little housing growth that has happened, particularly new affordable housing, has been concentrated in relatively few neighborhoods. Our housing shortage has many human costs that are felt every day by New Yorkers. In a tight housing market, landlords can charge high rents, and existing tenants are vulnerable to tenant harassment, poor housing quality, and displacement pressure as they are outbid for units. Not having enough homes is also a direct cause of homelessness. All this further worsens the neighborhood-based legacies of segregation, discrimination, and concentrated poverty that have led to the deeply unequal city we have today, where neighborhoods have unequal access to resources and opportunities. Next slide.
Changing our zoning can respond to these issues by increasing the number and the types of homes available for a range of incomes in every neighborhood across the city. If each neighborhood, from the highest density to the lowest density areas, adds a little more housing, New York City can add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing the dramatic changes or overtaxed infrastructure that residents fear. A little more housing in every neighborhood will have other big picture benefits for New York, including bolstering the local economy and supporting our environmental goals. This complements the other two City of Yes text amendments, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity and City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality. Next slide, please. So this is the biggest pro-housing change that DCP has ever undertaken, and we'll be touching the zoning for every part of the city. Tonight, we're going to focus on our biggest initiatives. In low-density areas, shown here in blue, we aim to enable missing middle housing or low-rise apartment buildings. We'll do this through town center zoning and commercial corridors and transit-oriented development in highly accessible areas. We also aim to help homeowners in the low-density areas by creating an ADU program and providing small buildings with additional flexibility to adapt over time. In medium and high-density areas, shown here in orange, our key proposal is the universal affordability preference, which will allow bigger buildings for affordable and supportive housing in every medium and high-density zoning district. Finally, we want to eliminate parking mandates citywide, removing the conflict between housing and parking. There are also a range of smaller proposals, including enabling conversions of non-residential buildings, allowing small and shared apartments, and facilitating the addition of new housing units to existing campus sites. We'll cover these briefly at the end of the presentation, but for now, I'll walk through some additional detail about each of our big moves. Next slide, please. Before getting into the low-density proposals, I want to provide a little background about these areas. This is the first time in decades that DCP is making significant zoning changes aimed at introducing new housing opportunities to these neighborhoods. And we've undertaken 2 years of detailed research to inform our proposals for the city's one-family, two-family, and low-density multifamily districts. What that research has shown us is that exclusionary zoning rules have effectively allowed many low-density neighborhoods to opt out of addressing our city's housing needs. This has put additional pressure on the high-density parts of the city to produce more and more housing. This wasn't always the case. Many of these restrictive rules were layered on in the 1990s and early 2000s. This means that the low-density areas actually have many buildings that would be illegal to build today. Small apartment buildings like the ones you see in these images define our low-density areas, but all our zoning allows you to build is often a single-family home. There are 18 different low-density zoning districts, and 12 of them claim that they allow you to build a two-family home or a low-density multifamily building. As you can see from the darker blue sections of this map, these areas are actually the majority of our low-density districts. But these districts have become two-family or multifamily in name only. If you were to actually try to build a building that had more than one unit in most of these districts, you wouldn't be able to do it. The parking requirements are so high that you couldn't physically fit both the building and the parking, for example, or the yard requirements are so extreme that the building's footprints couldn't accommodate multiple units. This purposefully confusing zoning is plainly exclusionary. We recognize that, and we aim to peel back that exclusionary zoning through our proposals. We also want to reintroduce housing types to these areas that can accommodate affordable housing, both modest buildings that are more naturally affordable than other types of construction, and apartment buildings at a scale in which they could take advantage of existing affordability programs. Next slide, please. One of the most exciting proposals is to re-legalize missing middle housing in low-density areas. This housing is called missing middle both because of its physical scale and because it tends to serve middle-income residents, since it's relatively affordable to build. We want to allow these low-rise apartment buildings on a variety of sites that we think make sense based on the existing architecture in low-density neighborhoods. First, we want to foster town centers in the low-density areas by allowing buildings with ground floor commercial uses and 3 to 4 floors of housing on top. About 5 square miles of New York City is zoned to allow low-density mixed-use buildings already. But if someone in these areas wanted to build a mixed building, there's almost no way they could do it. Height and floor area limits are lower than what is realistically necessary for this type of building, and parking requirements are extremely high. We propose adjustments to the zoning to make this type of building feasible where the zoning map already allows it. This will enable a kind of development that matches what's already in many of New York City's low-density neighborhoods better than the single-story commercial storefronts that are common on these blocks today. Next slide, please. Next, we want to promote transit-oriented development in the low-density districts. DCP is proposing a new geography that extends past our existing transit zone and identifies areas that have good access to transit. You can see this on the map. On the map, the low-density districts that fall into this area. Large sites that are in this area and are also located on a wide street or on the short end of the block would be able to build a low-rise apartment building, 3 to 5 stories, depending on the height limits of the underlying zoning district. This kind of transit-oriented development mirrors our existing context. It's very common in low-density neighborhoods to see a small apartment building on a corner with single or two-family homes mid-block, like what's in this image. Transit-oriented development also advances so many of our core planning goals by encouraging a little bit of housing in every neighborhood and sustainable development near transit. Next slide, please. In the rest of the low-density areas, we want to give homeowners flexibility. Under this proposal, a single or two-family home would be allowed to add a small accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU. There are a range of types of ADUs, including backyard cottages, garage conversions, or basement apartments. These small units will provide important housing options for small households, like a young person moving into their own place for the first time, or an elderly resident who wants to age in place. Because of their small size, they also serve different income levels than a large single-family home does. Other states' successful implementation of ADU programs shows us that these units can give multi-generational families a little more space and help middle-class homeowners with their household expenses. Many of the barriers to legalizing existing units, including basement apartments, are in state and local laws beyond zoning, but we are doing what we can to enable the safe legalization of those units. Next slide, please. The same rule changes that enable ADUs can also help homeowners who don't want to add an ADU, but just want a little more flexibility to adapt their homes to meet their needs. Our research shows us that many existing buildings are out of compliance, meaning that they're not in line with today's rules. For example, R401 districts are two-family districts that allow semi-detached buildings like the ones that you see here. But buildings like these pre-1961 duplexes could not be constructed today because they have more square footage than what we currently allow, as well as a smaller rear yard. These non-compliances can cause big headaches for homeowners if they need to borrow money from the bank, or if they want to make simple changes to their home, like renovating an outdated kitchen. We want to fix these rules, which will have dual benefits. First, homeowners of existing buildings won't run into issues when they go to make an alteration to their building, because the zoning will better match what's actually on the ground. Second, you'll actually be able to build a two-family home in a two-family district, or a multifamily home in a multifamily district, when today, the only thing that would be feasible is a single-family home. Next slide, please.
Next, we're going to turn our attention to the medium and high density areas of New York City, where our focus is on creating more opportunities for housing, including affordable housing. The Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP, is one of our big moves in medium and high density areas. Under our current zoning, each zoning district gets the same FAR, floor area ratio, or the amount of square feet you're allowed to build, regardless of whether you're building market rate or affordable housing. But there is an exception. If you're building affordable senior housing, you get more FAR, meaning you're allowed to build a bigger building. We want to take that existing preference for senior housing and just extend it to all types of affordable and supportive housing. This means that the FAR for market rate housing won't change, but you'll be allowed to build about 20% more so long as that extra room is occupied by affordable housing. There are a few districts that don't have the senior housing preference today, which is shown on this map in dark orange. So we'd be creating new FARs for those districts to enable housing in every neighborhood. We also want to make sure you're actually allowed to build a building that fits the square footage you're allowed. So we'll provide height increases in places where you need an extra story or so to actually fit the affordable housing. Next slide. Here I'll walk through one example of how universal affordability preference works. Let's say this church, located in R6 district, wants to build affordable housing. Today they get 3.0 FAR, regardless of whether developing market rate or affordable. And for this lot, this will allow them to build about 35 units. Under UAP, they get 3.9 FAR. But note that extra 0.9 FAR could only be used for affordable housing. If it is, they can build about 10 to 12 more affordable units. Now, 10 to 12 more affordable units may not sound like a lot, but this is functioning at a citywide scale. If every project has a few more affordable units, we can add a significant amount of affordable housing, and no single neighborhood will experience drastic changes. Next slide. So here's a graphical representation of how UAP will play out. Without UAP, the building is built according to the base FAR for market rate housing. The result is this 8-story apartment building. With UAP, the building can be about 20% bigger, which for this example translates to an additional 2 stories, so long as that difference is permanently affordable housing. In our preliminary calculations, we determined that had a UAP been in place since 2014, an additional 20,000 income-restricted affordable homes would have been created and housed 50,000 New Yorkers. Next slide. Finally, I'm going to present our parking proposals. Our parking mandate changes is one of our big moves. We'll be making parking optional for new housing everywhere. Our research shows us that current parking mandates outpace actual car ownership rates, meaning we're creating an oversupply of parking. Today, developers may underbuild to avoid triggering high and costly parking requirements. And the diagram on this slide represents how parking takes up a lot of space. 2 parking spaces equivalent to the size of a studio apartment. Building parking itself is also expensive and an obstacle to housing growth, especially affordable housing. On average, parking costs over $67,000 per underground spot. So we want to prioritize building housing over providing parking. Parking will still be allowed, and we anticipate that developers will respond to market needs and continue to provide parking in areas where there is demand, such as in areas of less access to transit. Through removing parking mandates, we can help lower rents, reduce the cost of housing construction, enable development of more homes in each new building. Next slide, please. So I'll walk through an example of how eliminating parking mandates can support housing growth. A developer sees this underutilized lot that's in a great location near transit and wants to convert the lot into an apartment building. The lot could accommodate 16 units, but the developer stops at just 10, so he can waive out the parking requirements, because as soon as he adds the 11th unit, he would need to provide 6 parking spaces. By limiting parking mandates, the developer can fully build out the lot to include those 6 additional units. Again, 6 additional apartments may not seem significant, but when hundreds of sites across the city are able to build more housing, that incremental change results in a lot more housing available to New Yorkers. Next slide, please. While not as major as the ones we just went through, there are a few other proposals that will enable some important projects and provide for a range of housing types. We want to enable conversions of underused buildings by extending existing adaptive reuse regulations to more parts of the city and buildings that were built more recently. First, we want to expand these regulations citywide to go beyond office districts to reach a broader range of buildings like vacant schools or former covens. Second, we want to move the cutoff date from 1961 or 1977 to 1990 in order to reach a more recent set of vacant and underutilized buildings. Third, we want to enable conversions to all types of housing, including supportive housing, shared housing, and dormitories. We also want to allow small and shared apartments through eliminating dwelling unit factor, which dictates minimum average unit size, and our transit zone, which are areas with good access to transit, which we think could help to serve marginally housed New Yorkers or others who want to live alone in a studio apartment. Today, we force too many people who want to live alone to find roommates and that take up family-sized units in many parts of the city. By enabling more small and shared apartments, that can help relieve some of the pressure on those family-sized units. Finally, previous development often took place under tower in the park style regulations known as height factor. Although we've developed a more recent set of regulations called quality housing that have height limits and result in better design, more contextual buildings, some sites like NYCHA campuses and irregularly shaped lots can't access those new rules. We want to extend allowances that enable height limited infill on sites that would otherwise be forced to develop tall, skinny buildings or nothing at all. Next slide. Altogether, the suite of zoning changes will result in equitable and sustainable housing development. More housing will be added across the entire city so that every neighborhood does its part to address our housing needs. and a few neighborhoods don't feel the intense pressure they do today. It's not just about more housing, though. It's also about more types of housing. Multifamily housing, where it's currently not allowed because of exclusionary zoning, units of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. Next slide. For next steps, the text amendment's draft scope of work was released yesterday, this past Tuesday, and is available on our website for review. We'll be hosting a public scoping meeting on October 26th. The text amendment will enter public review next spring, and there will be ample opportunity to share feedback before the text amendment's referral date. For the past year, we've been doing a lot of robust engagement, briefing a diverse range of stakeholders from community groups to elected officials. And we will continue our engagement work to solicit comments and feedback before we start to draft zoning text. And thank you for attending our info session. I can pass it back to Lara then.
Thank you so much, Winnie and Veronica, for walking us through the presentation on how changing zoning can respond to our housing issues. So this starts the portion of our Q&A. If we could go to the next slide, just so we can remind folks how you might be able to ask questions. Please feel free to keep using the app, keep using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will also now have the ability to do live Q&A. So you'll be able to raise your hand, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And so just a reminder to use the chat, just keep typing. You can type your questions right in there, and then we will call on those. There are a lot of questions that are coming in. We have this is the first of many conversations that we will have over the several months ahead. So I just want to make sure that you know that this is not the last conversation. We will make sure to get to questions either tonight or the months ahead. And with that, if you have one other thing, if you have any questions and you have dialed in, please press *9 to ask your question, and somebody will assist you to be able to unmic. So I'm going to start with the Q&A. Just give me 1 second. So Veronica and Winnie, I'm going to start with a question about ADUs. This question came in. I have a question specifically about ADUs. Are there plans to make height allowances for ADUs in places like the Rockaways and flood-prone areas?
Thanks for your question. So ADUs in the coastal flood zone will have to follow existing regulations for that geography, and they'll have access to those regs, including any allowances by zoning for coastal flood resiliency or previous zoning text amendments that are aimed at that area. But that also means that no livable floor area can be located below the floodplain. So in the coastal flood zones, there won't be subgrade ADUs, just to be clear, and no ADUs will be added in the high-risk special coastal risk districts where those apply.
Thank you so much. So we have a question about R1 zoning, that's not in the proposal. Why is abolition of R1 zoning not in the proposal? Many cities have done it around the country. R1 zoning is an outdated zoning code that does not help with the housing crisis.
Thanks. For those in the audience that are less familiar with our zoning districts, R1 and R2 districts are single-family districts. And single-family districts will continue to exist under this proposal, but central to this proposal is the idea that every neighborhood needs to contribute to meeting New York's urgent housing needs. And that does include the parts of the city that have single-family zoning. So the appropriate housing opportunities in those areas that we've identified include ADUs. So in single-family districts, single-family homes will have the opportunity to add an ADU, and we think that can help meet the needs of a broader range of households. There are very few single-family districts that are mapped near transit or with commercial overlays, but sites that do meet those criteria will also be eligible for our middle housing initiatives, like the town center zoning and transit-oriented development proposals I walked through, so that multifamily development could be introduced at limited appropriate locations. And we think these proposals actually better match the built context in the areas that we currently have zoned for single-family homes, as we found that a high number of non-conforming two-family and multifamily buildings actually exist in these districts. In fact, in one family districts, 22% of our housing stock already comes from buildings with 2 or more units. So there's already a great deal of variation there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Veronica. There are a handful of questions about universal affordable preference program that's that you talked about. What does the YAP interact with mandatory inclusionary housing laws?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how UAP will mix with MIH so that zoning districts within MIH areas would receive those higher UAP FARs and will retain the affordable set aside and AMI area meetup income requirements of the MIH options that are mapped within that area. So for example, like a specific district like R7A, the base FAR is 4, and the FAR they would get if it was an MIH project is 4.6. So under UAP, that MIH FAR get bumped to the new UAP FAR of 5.0. So just match with the new UAP FARs.
And can you just actually expand on that to what happens in a voluntary inclusionary housing bonus?
I think I'll pass that to John.
Hey
Sure.
folks, this is John Mangan, also from our housing division. So how will UAP interact with voluntary inclusionary program? We propose to replace the voluntary inclusionary programs, which include the inclusionary housing designated areas program in medium and higher density districts, and then the R10 inclusionary program dating to the 1980s. And we're really excited about this. Not only does it result in a simpler zoning framework, but today those voluntary inclusionary programs create units at 80% AMI and only 80% AMI and don't allow income averaging. And many of you know what's happened to AMIs in recent years. They've increased pretty significantly, such that 80% AMI is not as low income as it used to be. Through UAP, we believe we can do better than 80% AMI. Those discussions are ongoing now with our sister agency, HPD, and we can definitely enable income averaging so that units created through UAP will serve a much broader range of incomes, including much lower incomes than the voluntary inclusionary programs serve today. So we're very excited to make that update.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you joining us. So the next question in the chat is for transit-oriented development. City of Yes would legalize 3 to 5 story apartment buildings in current low density areas, but only on large lots, on wide streets or corner lots, and of course near transit options. This criteria seems very narrow. Have you done the analysis to see how many lots that would impact or create a map to visualize it? Sorry about that.
No problem. So we are currently conducting a full environmental review. Our draft scope of work was issued yesterday. So that environmental review will produce more information about exactly what we can expect to see from these proposals. But in general, we have undertaken preliminary analysis, of course, and we expect that there will be a significant number of sites that will be able to access those transit-oriented development regulations, either large sites that exist today or 5,000 square foot site that are assembled over time in a process of gradual incremental change in these neighborhoods. The idea here is that each neighborhood will only have, maybe a handful of sites, but a little bit of housing everywhere will go a long way to meet the city's housing needs.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for that answer. So I also see a good amount of hands raised, so I want to get to some of our live questions as well. And as a reminder, we'll be going back and forth from the written questions and questions from raised hands. Alicia Boyd, we'll start with you.
Alicia, you'll be promoted to panelist and have the ability to turn on your mic and camera. You should be able to rejoin shortly. Alicia, you should be able to turn on your mic and camera now.
Hi, Alicia, are you there?
I am trying to get on. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
we can.
Okay. Okay.
Good to
Yes. I find that your presentation lacks a lot of information. I sat there and read the article in the newspaper, and it had more details in this presentation. So I'm a little confused about why we're having this presentation when things like windowless apartments have not even been discussed. And, which is very daunting and very, scary, because it seems a very racist kind of space where you're going to be putting very low income people in these windowless buildings, and then kind of leaving them there to kind of live, even though 80 years ago, these things were outlawed because of the health issues that came about. So I'm not sure why this presentation is even happening, because you're not giving any kind of details. It's just a very vague and broad thing. But I do want to ask a question, because I think it's important for people to understand how the text amendments are kind of pulling each other. In your text amendment, your economic text amendment, you basically talk about the fact that economically you want to sit there and you want to change the zoning, commercial zoning, and you want to allow commercial development all within residential neighborhoods and inside of residential buildings. Obviously, because you want to put commercial in residential neighborhoods and in residential buildings, you're going to be reducing the residential population from that space. You also want to take away the designation of these commercial zones, and kind of allow, with this proposal, allow people to developers to come in and build in commercial districts. That's what I'm seeing. But again, not really clear by your presentation, but you say transit oriented and transit rich neighborhoods, which means in commercial corridors. And now, correct me if I'm wrong. In commercial corridors, let's say a C24, a C25, or a C28. Let's do a C28, which is all commercial. You would be able to now have a developer change that designation, make it into a residential designation, which is classified as a spot zoning, change that and now be able to build. Now you're claiming that the developer is going to watch this huge piece of property, only build 3 to 5 stories, when we have never seen developers build 3 to 5 stories on large lots in New York City in the past decade. We start out with these height limits of, let's say, 30 stories, like downtown Brooklyn, when they did that rezoning, and now we got 100-story buildings being built. So really what you're doing is you're breaking the commercial corridors. You're allowing residential into the commercial corridors under the pretext that it's only going to be 3 to 5 stories, knowing that developers will not adhere to the 3 to 5 stories. They'll tell everyone, we can't build because it's not enough height. They then will ask for higher heights, which they will get. And before you know it, on a commercial corridor that at one time had a 1-story building, you now have a 50-story building. Again, downtown Brooklyn is a pure example of that. So here you have, not only are you taking away residential development from the existing residential buildings underneath the business incentive, but now you're actually going into the commercial corridors and putting residential into the commercial corridors. So basically, you're really getting rid of zoning. You also talked, so I'm really concerned that you talk about a little bit in every community as if that's how developers work. Developers don't work in a little bit in every community. Developers work, oh, this is a hot community, we're going to develop this hot community. And anything that obstructs us from doing that, we want to get rid of. And that's what this program is about. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to say one more thing. People, there is a point where you're going to have to be reaching out to your city council people if you object to any of these proposals, because it's the city council that would be voting on this. And there needs to be a decision to get rid of the current mayor. And it should be anybody but Eric, because these proposals, even though they're telling us these are little things, these are major changes to our zoning laws that will have a tremendous effect upon how we live, where we shop, and basically just removing the zoning laws altogether and allowing developers to build wherever they want, including commercial inside of residential and residential inside of commercial. And the whole reason why we even have zoning to separate these entities has now been gone. Also, there is a town hall meeting that's happening by WBAI on 99.5 on October the 3rd at 6 o'clock. I suggest that people listen to that because there will be a different perspective that's presented about these text amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Appreciate that. So we're gonna break up your questions into a couple different answers here with different people. John, are you?
Sure. Yeah, I could take that. Thank you, Alicia. We appreciate your questions and comments. First, I do want to make clear that nothing in this proposal would enable windowless bedrooms, whether in conversions or whether in small or shared apartments or any other aspect of the proposal. The requirement for windows in bedrooms, which we support, is not in the zoning. It's a code issue and a state law, multiple dwelling law issue as well. And we don't propose to change that through the zoning, through these proposals, nor could we if we wanted to. Also, we're not proposing to newly enable residential in any commercial areas, nor are we proposing to newly enable commercial uses in any residential areas that don't currently allow them. We're enabling more of certain uses, but we're not newly enabling them anywhere. And so the proposals you were referring to, the town center zoning proposals, those are for low density commercial districts. So the commercial districts you mentioned are medium and higher density commercial districts, which do allow for higher heights than 3 to 5 stories. For our proposals in low density commercial districts, there would be an absolute height limit of 3 to 5 stories for developments in those areas. So there would be no way for developers to evade those hard height limits in the zoning. And when we say a little more housing everywhere, we really mean it. That's the fundamental goal of this proposal. And part of the benefits of that approach, of a citywide approach, a little more housing everywhere, is that it can help to take pressure off some of the neighborhoods that have borne the brunt of the housing shortage in recent years. I'm thinking of gentrifying neighborhoods or neighborhoods like yours that really have experienced a lot of development pressure in recent years because there are all these other parts of the city where you can't build anything at all. You're caught in a hammer between lower density districts that aren't producing any housing and medium and higher density districts that have really restrictive zoning and aren't producing any housing. And that puts a ton of pressure on areas like Central Brooklyn that have seen a lot of development and seen massive increases in rents in recent years. And so that's what this strategy is fundamentally aimed at, a little more everywhere to enable development to flow to the higher market areas and take the pressure off of gentrifying areas and other parts of the city that have borne the brunt of the housing shortage in recent years.
Thank you, John, for addressing those questions. We'd like to go to the next hand raised, which is Agnes Bandina.
Agnes, you'll be promoted to panelist shortly. Agnes, if you can hear me, we're attempting to promote you to panelist so that you can ask your question. You may need to click on the button that's appearing on your screen to accept the promotion. I'm getting a message from the system saying that it was declined. Hold on one moment. Agnes, we're still having trouble getting you into the panelist section so that you can turn on your mic and camera? Okay, I think Agnes may be having a technical difficulty. Agnes, if you want, you can use the Q&A function and we'll be able to find your question there. Or we could try coming back to you later.
Okay. So we'll move to the next person. Tom, I just want to make sure that's Samir.
Correct. Samir will be promoting you to panelist. Samir, you should be able to, there you are.
Hello. So I live in Midtown, and I know that there's the Midtown mixed use plan that's coming down the pipe, and we'll expect to see that at the community board soon. I wanted to know, how does that interact with the proposals in this zoning text amendment when it comes to office conversions? Are these required in order to make the mixed use plan in Midtown possible? Are they completely separate? Thank you.
John, is that
Sure.
you?
Yeah, thanks, Samir. Those are great questions. So the Midtown rezoning proposal is a zoning map change in 4 different parts of Midtown South to newly enable residential uses in manufacturing districts that don't allow them today. So a zoning map change to enable new uses where they're not allowed today. These are zoning text amendments that are broader than that, citywide, and generally only touch those areas of the city that already allow residential. So unlike the Midtown proposals, we are not newly enabling residential in any parts of the city. However, you're right, they do interact. Our conversions proposal would apply within those areas of Midtown. If the existing regs were in place in those areas of Midtown, then you would be able to convert buildings that are pre-1961 buildings, and you'd be able to convert them only to conventional apartments, not other forms of housing like supportive housing or shared units or dorms or things like that. If these proposals, the housing opportunity proposals, pass, then you would also be able to convert within those areas any building built before 1990, and you would be able to convert to things like supportive housing, convert to dorms, convert to shared housing models and things like that. So they have independent utility, but they would interact in a way that we think would be beneficial for that part of the city.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much for being here and answering all our questions.
Thank you.
So much, Samir. I'm going to take one more hand and then we'll go back to some of the written questions. Joshua Spiegel. Joshua, can you hear us?
Hi, thank you everyone for answering all these questions. I actually had a question about that cutoff for conversion of underused buildings. If we're moving it up to 1990, what is the rationale there? Why not sort of allow any building, underutilized office buildings and such, to be converted? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joshua. That's a great question. So our adaptive reuse regulations provide a relaxed set of light and air standards to enable non-residential buildings that can't otherwise comply with the residential bulk regulations like light and air provisions that enable those buildings to convert to residential. If we didn't have any cutoff date at all, then you'd be able to build what you were calling a commercial building and then just file an alteration with DOB the next day and convert it to residential, enabling you to comply with a looser set of light and air regulations that we think are great and perfectly acceptable and fantastic for underutilized or vacant non-residential buildings converting to residential, but that we don't necessarily, want to enable for new buildings being built today. So we look to the past and the type of cutoff date, the interval that we had when making similar changes in the past, and decided that about 30 years is the right amount. That represents, a useful life cycle of a building, after which, if they are struggling, if they're underutilized or vacant, it may be a good idea to enable them to convert to residential. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Lara, you're on mute.
Thank you. So we're going to go back to our questions. Let me just get back to our screen. So this one team is about parking minimums. How does removing parking minimums complement different goals of the city, such as transportation, climate, and obviously housing as well? In this question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So as we mentioned in the presentation, parking takes up a lot of space, space that could be used to build housing. It is also quite expensive. So it adds to the additional cost of like developing a building. And in theory, if it was a lot cheaper to do that, but without having to provide parking, those savings would trickle down and help tenants not have to pay such high rents. So that's another benefit of that. And of course, since New York City has such great access to transit, and we don't need to actually require such an oversupply of parking, and that would complement our climate goals as well. So that's another way that, eliminating parking mandates for new housing would help support those efforts.
Thank you, Winnie. And just to follow up on that, particularly on the housing aspect, if parking requirements are lifted, does that mean that everyone would depend on street parking?
Yes, that's a great question. Of course, even though we're lifting parking mandates, you can still provide parking for new projects, and we still anticipate that developers who are building in neighborhoods that have historically relied on car access will continue to provide those parking spaces for residents. And we're not removing any existing parking. So if your current building has parking on it, it will not be removed, and it will have to be, if they want to, would be discretionary action to actually go through the process of removing existing parking. So we're not touching existing parking, and we anticipate that parking will still be provided in projects where that makes sense.
Thank you, Winnie. I want to pivot to shared apartments. Can you define what you mean by shared apartments? What are common areas would be?
Yes, that is a good question, especially since these are a housing type we don't really see anymore, so it's not very common. But shared apartments are individually occupied rooming units with shared living facilities. So spaces like kitchens or bathrooms, and other things like dining areas. So things like, back in your college dorms kind of environment of having your own bedroom, but sharing those other spaces.
Great. John, this kind of goes back to a little bit of the question that was asked earlier. What is the functional definition of a little more housing? What are the percentage increase over the existing number of units? What percentage increase over the existing number of units?
That's a great question. And as Winnie mentioned earlier, we're embarking right now on our environmental review process. We published, for instance, the draft scope of work just yesterday. I put a link in the chat, and people should read that, dig into the details of this proposal. Through the environmental review process, part of that is a more textured analysis of where we expect these proposals to produce more housing. Like we said, we don't expect it to result in dramatic change in any one neighborhood. That said, it's not going to be perfectly uniform across the city as well. Part of the silver lining, if you might call it that, of the fact that New York City is behind some other jurisdictions in making these types of reforms is that we can look to other cities to get a pretty good idea of what loosening zoning a little bit everywhere results in. And what we've seen is that under those conditions, development will tend to flow towards the higher market areas where, development wants to go, but where, zoning restrictions don't allow it today. So we would expect a little bit more emphasis on the higher market areas of the city, as opposed to, areas where newly constructed housing isn't going to, rent for as much or be sold for enough. That's part and parcel of the answer I gave previously to Ms. Boyd about how we expect that enabling a little more housing everywhere, enabling development to flow to those higher market areas will take some of the pressure off of gentrifying areas and other parts of the city that have really borne the brunt of the housing shortage. That's what we expect. Stay tuned for more details in the environmental impact statement, which we will be producing over the next 6 months.
Thank you, John. I want to ask a question about the combination of units. So it says, what is being done to stem the conversion of 3 or 4 family homes to single family homes, thereby eliminating apartments in gentrified neighborhoods? This person specified Carroll Gardens, Upper West Side as examples.
That's a great question, and one that we have our eyes on as well. This unit combination phenomenon, brownstones being converted from multifamily back into single family homes, or unit combinations in other wealthy areas like multifamily buildings on the Upper East Side that have resulted in some parts of the city and an overall reduction in the number of units at a time of worsening housing shortage. We see those as kind of the higher market area version of the displacement pressures that we see in lower income parts of the city as well, as people with money go farther and farther out looking for housing that they can afford, putting pressure on neighborhoods that may have historically had low rents. And the fundamental driver of all of that, like Dan said at the outset of this presentation and Winnie and Veronica underscored, the fundamental driver of all of that is just the fact that there's not enough housing, and there are severe restrictions on building new housing, often in some of the highest market parts of the city. And so the best way to address that is not to try to ban unit combinations. I don't even think that it would be legal or effective to do so. We certainly haven't seen any examples of that from any other jurisdictions. The answer is not to do that. That's just trying to outlaw a symptom. The answer is what we're doing here, which is to enable a little more housing in every part of the city so that you don't get that kind of extreme pressure in Brownstone, Brooklyn, extreme pressure in the Upper East Side. That means that if I'm a rich person and I want more room, I have to literally take it away from somebody else.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. Appreciate that in-depth answer. I think as the team keeps populating more questions into my spreadsheet, I'm just going to go back to some of the raised hands, and then we can kind of jump back and forth again. So Backup House, if you could promote Nat DeFries. Nat, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello.
There.
Thanks for working on this project, and thanks for answering questions. I wanted to say that everything sounds really, really good. I am particularly in favor of the removal of parking minimums, the parking mandates. Really make it a lot more expensive to build housing, and they add a lot of extra regulations and red tape when people are trying to build more housing. So that's really great to hear that you're considering that. I also wanted to chime in about how I would also like to see the R1 zoning removed or even just bumped up to like R2 or something, because we should be trying to build the city that we want, not for the city that we have. My question is, if considered setting parking maximums, I know that more politically difficult, but it also can have a much bigger impact on, for example, reducing car usage, which also helps climate and helps fund mass transit and helps reduce traffic violence. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nat.
Yeah, that's a great
Winnie?
question. So we aren't proposing parking maximum, so it's exciting to hear there's a desire for that, because we're focused on removing barriers to housing. And we think eliminating those requirements, such as parking mandates, which is, as you mentioned, a significant barrier to a lot of projects, is an important first step. And removing these mandates helps provide, additional housing over parking, but also gives individual projects the flexibility to decide what the appropriate amount of parking is for development. So we aren't proposing a cap because we don't think it's like necessary. We looked at the developments. The new developments are going up in our transit zone. So that's a geography that we defined as having really good access to transit. We found that fewer than like 1 in 5 developments provided more parking than what was required. And in Manhattan, where we do have a cap, we see like the majority of sites that develop there have 0 parking, and those that do mostly provide well under the cap. So we don't think that adding a cap is necessary, and it just makes it a bit more complex and adds additional costs for developments where there may be like a good planning rationale for providing more than what is currently required today, such as like limited demand for parking in areas where the overall supply for parking is declining, or if there's like a hub for electric car charging, for example. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Thanks again. And yeah, I just want to emphasize that this all sounds really, really good, and I'm excited.
Thank you so much, Nat. We'll go to the next hand, Ro McAllister.
Ro, you should, or maybe receiving a notification asking to accept a promotion to panelist. You may need to click on that button so that we can, I'm getting a system message saying that Ro declined. That may be an error.
Want to send one more?
Yep.
Thank you, Tom.
Ro, if you see the pop-up, you can click on it. I'm getting another error message. Ro, if you'd like to add your question.
Yeah, Ro, if you would like to add your question to the chat, we'll be looking out for it, and we can make sure to get to that. Tom, just making sure the next hand
Is
that's
Sirio
up.
Guardino.
Okay, thank you. Sirio?
He is rejoining.
Hello?
Hi there.
Hi, I'm sorry. I was on a call. What I wanted to say and acknowledge is I hear about the eliminating parking. I live up in Norwood and Bedford Park neighborhoods of the Bronx, and we have been oversaturated with development of very tall buildings. I have seen 8 to 12 private homes bulldozed to make way for 13-story buildings at 203rd Street and 201st Street, 202nd Street, and right off of Marshalloo Parkway. And they had those streets was single family homes and two-family homes, and they were bulldozed out on streets that were made for single driving. They were one-way streets is what I'm trying to say. And we have now been saturated. Everywhere we turn, there's a huge building being put up. And our schools are suffering tremendously with overpopulating with our students. And what's going to happen is you keep building these huge buildings and you're going to have to bus kids outside of their own neighborhood. This used to be a small residential neighborhood, Norwood and Bedford Park. And now it is a massive towers of buildings where people live, and it's too much congregation and too much overkill. And I really wish that you would put a stop to what's being built in Norwood and Bedford Park in the Bronx, because we have, for the last 5 to 6 years, stepped up to the plate and gave up our neighborhoods for this development for people to live in. And we are suffering now with the lack of services from the city. And that's basically what I wanted to say.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your question.
Oh, it's
Veronica,
really a comment. I ain't got no question.
well, let us address that.
Okay.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing your experience in the Bronx. As I think we've mentioned before, we recognize that many neighborhoods throughout New York City have experienced intense development pressures. They've felt unfairly targeted and that they're bearing more than their fair share of the burden of meeting New York City's housing needs. That's why our proposal is aimed at introducing housing opportunities to every part of the city. If every part of the city adds a little more housing, we're hoping that those neighborhoods that have experienced this intense development pressure won't experience it so acutely, and that they won't experience the kind of infrastructure demands that you were concerned about. So hopefully that helps address your comment.
And we'll keep talking about this. So we have plenty of months to keep talking about how that works and how we build a little bit of housing in each neighborhood. Let's take one more question by hand, and then let's get to some of the many great questions in the chat. Ben Wetzler.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I live on the east side in Manhattan, which is one of the designated transit zones, which makes sense. We have a bunch of subways here. And I noticed when I was reading through the plan that there's a proposal to eliminate the dwelling unit factor, the requirement that apartments be bigger than a certain size, which I'm supportive of that change because I think it doesn't really make sense that there's you can't build smaller apartments, but you can build giant ones that take up the entire floor of a building if you want. So I'm fine with that. I'm just wondering why that's only being restricted, or did I misread the plan and that's only going to be in Manhattan and in the other transit areas, or is that going to be in the whole city? And if I am correct about that, why is that? Why wouldn't you want to get rid of it for the rest of the city as well?
Great question.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and very close reading of our draft scope of work. Impressive, you gotten through it. So basically the proposal would eliminate dwelling unit factor within the transit zone. So that covers your neighborhood, of course. So the idea is that zoning would no longer pose a barrier to developers who want to do projects consisting of like small units, such as studio apartments. However, this doesn't mean like unit size is completely unregulated. It's still regulated by other laws like the building code, housing maintenance code, and multiple dwelling law. We're just zoning is stepping out of that conversation. For areas that are outside of the transit zone, we would eliminate dwelling unit factor for one or single family or two family homes because like those types of typologies already regulate density themselves. And then for other areas that are outside of transit zone, we would reduce and simplify dwelling unit factor. So we just equalize that in all districts to 500. If you've looked at one of them, there's like lots of different numbers there. So we're just making that a lot easier because right now it's dwelling unit factor is one of the big obstacles developing two-family homes in two-family districts or multifamily homes in multifamily districts. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Winnie. Appreciate that. So I'm gonna go back to the spreadsheet. This is again a question about ADUs. How would the cost to rent of ADUs be controlled? A small unit is not necessarily an affordable unit.
Thanks. So within the zoning, we're not proposing rent regulation for ADUs, but the ADU program would create an option for modest rental housing in neighborhoods that have produced little new housing in recent years. And this creating more supply and a greater diversity of housing types in these areas would create housing types that are more affordable and more available to renters in those areas. We also have the benefit of learning from other cities that have already implemented ADU programs. And their experiences show us that ADUs are often naturally affordable and can rent below market rate, especially since many people choose to rent to people they already know or extended family members. You also might be another opportunity for someone who holds a housing voucher to use that in their area.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And another question just about ADUs as well. It's in relation to the state regulations on this. So why are accessory dwelling units, which is what ADU stands for, being proposed again if it was already rejected recently when proposed by Governor Hochul?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, accessory dwelling units have big benefits for homeowners, especially middle-class homeowners. Middle-class homeowners, can use that rental income from their ADU to generate a little bit of extra income to cover their household expenses if they choose. Or multi-generational families might benefit from having access to a little more space. No one has to add an ADU, obviously, if it doesn't make sense for them. It's completely their own choice. But we think one or two family homeowners should have the option to do so. And just because the state didn't take action, they shouldn't be excluded from that kind of flexibility. It's also, of course, an important form of housing that adds new housing types to our low density areas.
Great. And I just want to, I want to piggyback on that to talk a little bit about process. Yes, the state level process failed. We give a lot of credit to the governor for changing the conversation around housing, the housing shortage, and the consequences of the housing shortage in New York City and New York State. However, the state level process didn't allow for a ton of time to have those conversations, allay people's concerns and people's fears, and try to build that coalition to make these types of reforms happen. We really hope to see that in future years. But fortunately, we have the luxury of time here at the city level. We've been talking to stakeholders, council members, and other folks around the city about these proposals for, going on a year now, and we have a lot of time until we get to official public review. And so we really hope that we can have those conversations, that we can allay those concerns, that we can lay the groundwork in order to come up with a different result here. And, the public info session tonight is part of that process.
Thanks, John. This next question is more geared towards design. When we think about how high, how dense a building may be or a neighborhood might be, we consistently talk about how wide a street is to help make the pedestrian experience, the feeling of that. So the question here is, you had mentioned something about wide streets for the purpose of this proposal. Can you describe that a little bit?
Sure. So wide street is technically defined in the zoning as a street of 75 feet in width or more. And so I mentioned wide streets in the proposal as one of the criteria for lots that could access our transit-oriented development regs. We think that, we found in our research that existing apartment buildings in the low density areas often exist on wide streets or on the short end of the block. And so by making these criteria applicable to new transit-oriented development, we're mirroring that successful organic development that's in place from before our restrictive zoning.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. So this one is geared towards town centers. The town center zoning proposals are fantastic and will make low density districts a lot more walkable and add daily needs for residents nearby, but are limited to low density districts. What about commercial corridors and lots of high cost areas that are mapped in the zoning code as a residential R6A/B and have had so little development? An example of park slope has been defined here in the question. Can we expand the scope of the town center zoning proposal to include commercial corridors in mid-density districts?
Thanks. So the town center zoning proposals are designed specifically to address the zoning impediments that are in our low density districts. So those very restrictive height limits and very low FARs that are in the low density commercial districts. But some of our underdeveloped mixed use areas and medium to high density areas can benefit from some of the other proposals that we went through actually. So for example, you mentioned R6A and R6B districts specifically. Those districts will be able to take advantage of the universal affordability preference. They also will, of course, benefit from the removal of residential parking mandates, as will the entire city. We're also, of course, pursuing another text amendment as part of City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, which hopefully will help breathe new life into some of these underdeveloped commercial corridors.
Thank you. So I want to move into some questions about the universal affordability preference. Will these affordable apartments remain affordability indefinitely? Will they be regulated? Are they considered rent stabilization or have regulatory agreements? And they give examples of J51 or 421A tax incentives. What will happen to these apartments if the Supreme Court does away with rent regulations?
That's a great cluster of questions. One of the great things about the universal affordability preference is that it fundamentally changes the nature of the zoning in medium and high density districts, such that any new development, in order to achieve the maximum allowable size of a building, will have to provide permanently affordable housing. That's a fundamental difference. In most medium and high density districts today, outside of the limited inclusionary housing areas or MIH areas, that's not the case. And when you get, a 421A unit or a J51 unit, it's affordable for a period of time, but that burns off, 30, 25 or 30 years down the line. When we are baking it into the zoning framework like this, then you can require permanent affordability as part of these units, similar to existing IH units or existing affordable senior units. If you take advantage of that zoning allowance in order to build a bigger building, then the extra part of the building that was enabled by that affordable housing, that has to remain affordable in perpetuity. So it just underscores the fundamental nature of the shift in medium and high density districts that UAP represents, and we're really excited about it.
Thank you. I actually want to go back to some of the raised hands. We have a delicate balance because there's so many questions in each, so I'm going to try to keep going back and forth. So George Doyle, if you're available.
George, you should be able to turn on your camera and microphone.
Hello?
Hi, George. Can you hear us?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Hey there.
My question has to do with Staten Island. We do not have the same opportunities in transit as the other four boroughs. And your talk about ending the parking mandate for a borough that is vehicle orientated, how is that going to help us with your proposal?
John, do you want to, or Winnie?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And that's definitely something we are aware of when we were crafting our parking proposals, that there are definitely parts of New York City that are still very car dependent. And we've been speaking to like the Staten Island, like Borough President's office about this, and like understanding that this is an important concern for residents of Staten Island. So our understanding is that for developers that are building projects in Staten Island, they will likely continue to provide parking because they understand there is such a demand for it and that it's such a car-oriented neighborhood. So even though we just want to make sure that parking mandates are not in the way of developing housing, but that we anticipate it will still be provided in those areas.
Thank you. Go to the next hand, Michelle Berman. Michelle, can you hear us? We can see you're on, you just might need to unmic.
Hello, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to make a couple of comments. The first of which is that the impact of some of your zoning in the suburban areas or single family dwelling areas where the population initially had an expectation of a certain quality of life by moving in to a community that has it's a private home and they have land and they have some outdoor space, et cetera, et cetera. And if you then permit, whether or not they take advantage of it, if you then permit their neighbors to build additional dwellings on that property or expand in a way that can infringe on their quality of life, you are very much impinging on their quality of life and on their expectation when they made this most major investment, which for most people is the primary investment in their life, which is their private home. So to say that everybody's going to give a little here does not necessarily mean that's your version of a little, but it really doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to more heavily impact some residents than others. And I think actually it will. I also want to point to the super talls that are going on. In my neighborhood, we're asking for height limits because our research has shown that the taller the building, the less density it has. That, of course, with development, there's always a profit motive, and that is pretty much the grinding, the motor of our city. I'm not interested in eliminating that. However, when you build a very high building, the money may be at the top, but it becomes an incentive for the developer to build fewer apartments in that building and to make it, I'll use the word luxury, but you can have larger apartments on this footprint. And in order to build that building, I find that we're tearing down more affordable housing than we are gaining. And in fact, a member of our community did this research and he did it on 14 buildings. And in all but one of the buildings, housing was lost when these buildings went up that were very high, over 25 story or 210 or 300 feet high. Not to mention the sustainability of those buildings and their impact on the environment, which has been clearly shown. So I'm wondering how you reconcile that with some of your zoning proposals, not all of them, but some of them. And also how you account for the rights of a developer, the profit motive, and what you can legally do in order to manipulate each individual property so that it, in theory, results in the kind of dwelling that you're hoping it will result in. So there's a comment and a few questions in there, but if you can in some way address it, I'd be pleased. So thank you very much. I appreciate this forum very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. John, did you want to try to address that?
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. I'll try to address your questions in turn. With our low density proposals, I'd say we were doing two things. One, we were looking to New York City's past, to building forms that had worked in previous eras in New York City history, but that we'd rendered illegal in 1961 or through other zoning restrictions in years since. Another is that we look to other jurisdictions in other parts of the country who have done similar types of things. And that's helpful because you can see like what results and who takes advantage of this type of thing. And so we feel very good about our low density proposals in that they are either enabling building forms that already exist and work really well in New York, like 2, 3, 4 stories above a commercial ground floor, or that have worked really well in other jurisdictions, like ADUs. I was reading some research about the rollout of ADUs in different jurisdictions in California the other day. It's a Furman Center paper on who has taken up ADUs in California. And it's just amazing research that shows who takes it up. It's not the wealthy homeowners who don't need space, who don't need money. It's folks like right in the middle of that income distribution who might need a little more room for a family member or a little more income to meet the mortgage. And you're not transforming neighborhoods through these proposals either. On a given block in a low density area of 1 or 2 family homes, maybe you'll get a couple few people adding an ADU. Over time, it might be more, but that change is just going to be really gradual in a way that has not resulted in some of the things that you fear in the comment that you laid out there about some of the lower density proposals. In terms of tall buildings, the thrust of these proposals, as you can see, is to try to adjust the zoning to enable things that can't happen today. We are generally not looking to restrict things that you can do today or take away from, what property owners have and can do today. That said, we do have some proposals. It was kind of the last thing on the odds and ends slide that Veronica presented that would enable height limited quality housing infill. Quality housing is a type of zoning that was introduced in the 1980s that has definite height limits on types of sites that can't do that today. That is, types of sites where bad zoning forces developers to build tall, skinny buildings that, sometimes drive people crazy. And so we are systematically looking at the types of sites where developers have to go tall and skinny today, even though a lot of times they don't actually want to. They get less FAR, that is, less dense, like the research that your colleague created, which we'd like to take a look at, by the way. And they're a less efficient building form. It's more expensive for them to build those super tall buildings than it is to do, a height limited quality housing type building. So we're looking at residential campuses. We're looking at zoning lots with existing buildings where sometimes you can't do that height limited infill today. And we're looking at irregular sites. Maybe they're weird shaped, or maybe they have elevated infrastructure by them, where, again, bad zoning forces people to build tall, skinny buildings that sometimes drive neighborhoods crazy. We are systematically enabling on those types of sites height limited quality housing infill that we think will go a long way to address some of the concerns that we hear from neighborhoods around the city about the types of buildings that you mentioned.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Let's go to Hazel. Hazel Martinez. Hazel, can you hear us? You might need to unmic. Is it possible for Becca House to help unmic?
Yes, hello.
There we go.
Hey, hi there.
Yes. Yes, good evening. I'm concerned about, I'd like to know, first of all, have any of you actually visited these neighborhoods you're talking about? Because our neighborhoods, especially in the East Flatbush section of Brooklyn where I live, has been inundated with construction, and every other house is now a 4 or 5 story building. You even have one that's over 20 stories in a place that's zoned R4, which is a residential area. And we don't have, and I think that it's created a transient neighborhood instead of the cohesive neighborhood we once had. Now, no one knows these people, they come and go, and because the rents are so high, people are moving in and out quite frequently. So I don't think it adds to a community. It doesn't create any sense of someone really belonging somewhere. It's just, I view it as a destruction of the community. And I am disturbed that it seems that zoning would be eliminated really when our community is looking to rezone. And I think this would have a negative impact on that proposal. And it seems like this current administration and the past one doesn't really care about the residents. They don't care about small homeowners. They're really very much developer driven. And I'm really concerned about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Hazel. I mean, we hear a lot from your community district. John, did you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, we completely understand that your neighborhood in particular is under a lot of pressure. And I think that those types of neighborhoods are absolutely central in our consideration when we were putting these proposals together, because there are definite identifiable parts of the city that have borne the brunt of the housing shortage. That may be areas in locations such that they're experiencing gentrification. They're a desirable place to live that historically had lower rents, and now people with higher incomes are moving in and out competing existing residents for apartments. Or it might be parts of the city that have the remaining development sites. Like, I think of this as like an East Flatbush situation where it's like the zoning is relatively loose compared to a lot of other areas in the city. And so that's where the development gets funneled. So a big part of enabling more housing in every part of the city is to ensure that there's not some mad rush after single family homes in East Flatbush, since that's the only place that you can build. And so we think of this proposal as being particularly good for neighborhoods like yours. And as far as, have we visited these neighborhoods? Yeah, of course. I mean, we've worked very closely with our borough offices, and folks from Housing Division themselves fanned out a couple weeks ago, in addition to the extensive background and existing conditions research we did on neighborhoods there, to just, actually make sure that we're walking these neighborhoods, that we're taking pictures, that we're looking at, the real existing conditions as we put together these proposals. We're definitely not trying to, do this stuff from an ivory tower. So we appreciate that sentiment as well.
Thank you, John. I'm going to take a couple more hands and then we'll go back to the written questions. I do want to do a time check. This meeting is scheduled until 8:30. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. But again, this is just the beginning of many conversations that we will be having with you, and we'll be able to address more questions and to talk through more of the proposal. So let's go to Marguerite.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, thanks for joining.
Good evening. Hi, I have so many questions. My screen froze for a little while, so forgive me if I'm asking anything that's already been asked.
No problem.
Yeah, so when you say you're gonna put a little more in every neighborhood, and how are you dividing up the city by community board, like a little more in each community board, or are you going, like, how are you dividing up the city for that? That's my first question. And the other is, has anybody talked about AMI yet, specifically about readjusting it and the way it is calculated? Is the city thinking of, changing that or recalculating it? And my third question is more about the ADU. I'm concerned about that as a homeowner, because I own my own home. And if someone does build on their property next to me, or are there restrictions to what they can build, or can they build another dwelling that's almost the same size as the dwelling that's currently there? So can they build to the same height and to the end of the lot, or are there going to be restrictions to keep it just a small, like, cottage style dwelling? I think those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Oh, wait,
thank you so much.
I have one more question. So if the zoning is going to be loosened up, are developers still going to have to come to community boards for waivers, for zoning waivers, or are you going to make that defunct?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. John, you want to?
I'll
Take that
take questions 1 and 3, and then I'll pass it to John for 2 and 4. So I'm going to first cover your question about neighborhoods, how we're defining neighborhoods. So when we say a little housing in every neighborhood, I want to be clear that what we're not proposing is like some sort of mandate in which every geography has to produce X number of units. It seems like there has been a little bit of confusion for that in the chat. So a little bit of housing in every neighborhood just means that every neighborhood, define it how you want, because every part of the city needs to be meeting the city's housing needs. So every community board, every neighborhood needs to be doing its part to meet our urgent housing needs. Next, your question about ADUs and what the limitations on those would be. So ADUs would be size limited. We've placed that at 800 square feet. There would also be limitations on where it could locate on the lot, like how there are limitations where a building can locate on the lot. So there would be yard requirements. So it'd have to locate 5 feet at least from the lot line, and meaning you'd have to have space from your neighbor's lot. There would also, it would have to be 10 feet if you're building a detached backyard ADU. It would have to be 10 feet from the primary dwelling. The ADU is also part of your general floor area, so you don't have unlimited capacity to build an ADU. You would only be able to build as much as you're allowed under the FAR limits in your zoning district. So there are, we're taking into consideration these regs and how it impacts both the, surrounding lots, as well as what's available under the development rights of the lot adding the ADU. I'll pass it to John or Winnie if they want to take the AMI question and the
to go into CB stuff. Yeah, that's a useful opportunity to compare and contrast the text amendment that we're doing here from the types of actions where you see a developer going to the community board or seeking rezoning or something like that. This text amendment in any one area really represents incremental change that is far less in magnitude than what you would typically see in a rezoning, whether a private rezoning where a developer is seeking a rezoning of a manufacturing area to one that allows residential, or is seeking a significant residential upzoning that might be a 50% increase, an 80% increase, or a 200% increase. Those are the types of situations where developers typically apply for a rezoning and go to the CBs to say, here's why I'm asking for a pretty dramatic change in this one area. This text amendment really wouldn't do anything that dramatic with respect to any one site. And so in many ways, even though this is citywide, this is so broad geographically, from the perspective of your house in your neighborhood, it's probably represents a less dramatic change than if your next door neighbor was applying for a significant upzoning, or if the lot on the corner was being rezoned from manufacturing to residential. And so we really want to underscore that point, that if we do a little more everywhere, that we can create a ton of housing, but without that kind of dramatic change that, overtaxes infrastructure, that changes the character of the neighborhood, that sort of thing. On the AMIs question, the AMIs come from the federal government, from HUD, and I think of them not as a set of requirements that mandate any like particular level of affordability, but rather a metric that enables different types of affordable housing programs to talk to each other. So that if you have 100% affordable building that's taking low-income housing tax credits and getting an Article 11 tax exemption and maybe getting some subsidy from HPD or whatever, that you can describe those units and those requirements over time. We recognize that AMIs have increased a lot in recent years, and so we are looking to ensure that where affordability is required in these proposals, that we're doing better than the current 80% AMI that exists in a lot of zoning requirements like inclusionary housing. Not only that, but we also want to enable income averaging to ensure that when new affordable units are created, they serve as broad a possible swath of New York City families, including AMIs down to 30–40%.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple more raised hands, and then I just want to do a couple more of the written questions as well. Again, it's 8:20. We're scheduled to be here till 8:30. We're going to do our best to kind of get as many questions, but again, you will be able to reach out to us via the email that we'll make sure to put in the chat again before the end of the night, as well as please check out our website. So can we go to Nicole?
Okay. Can you see me?
Yes.
Can you see me, guys?
I can see you.
Yes.
You're cutting out a little bit because you're cutting out a little bit, but we do see you.
You might want to turn your camera off so that you're able to have more bandwidth with the microphone.
So can you? Yeah, I gladly do that.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
First of all, thank you guys very much for hosting this evening. And again, I live in a very sought after neighborhood in Brooklyn, Crown Heights, Prospect Heights. And my big question for you guys is when you talk about the AMI, and for anybody who doesn't know what AMI means, it means the average medium income, and which is based not on your neighborhood, it's based on a broader scope of neighborhoods, including Westchester. So when all of a sudden your neighborhood's AMI is increasing, it's not based on your Crown Heights or wherever you live neighborhood income, it's broader. So whenever a developer comes up and says, oh, we are offering 40% AMI, yet again, 40% then means within a 2 to 3 no, 80%. I'm sorry, that's what the developer is proposing. 80% means it's 95 further up in a household, which is not based on the neighborhood you live in. It's broader. So I would love for you guys, City of House, I almost called you town of sorry, I'm nervous. I would like you guys to consider, because when we keep talking about we need housing in New York City, yes, we do. But we don't need market rate housing or luxury housing anymore. We need truly affordable housing, because everybody is pushed out. Because what does affordability mean based on this average medium income that I pointed out earlier, which is based on so many other boroughs, not just your borough. And then when you guys spoke about the low density, it always includes like a tiny little bit of like truly affordable and then market rate and luxury housings. And then I also want to bring upon you guys the city of housing, that when you talk about manufacturing neighborhoods that are low density, there are still some standing manufacturing businesses that own the property. They're just family businesses, but due to all the rezoning and the neighborhood change, their property tax is gonna be what's gonna kill them. So we will have to have something that helps existing true property like manufacturers to be exempt from the increase in taxes that the new developments will bring. And I'm not anti-change. I'm all for let's house our New Yorkers, but let's stop the fucking let's stop marking rate and luxurious buildings. We have plenty of them. We need true affordable housings to keep our beautiful city creative and beautiful. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for speaking tonight. I appreciate that so much. If we can, John, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Nicole, for highlighting a really important issue. I'm sorry that I didn't explain what AMI is or attach numbers to it. Sometimes, forget that not everybody is talking about AMI all day like we are. For instance, 80% AMI, which is the HUD low income limit, in recent years has increased significantly, such that an 80% AMI unit for a family of 3 is about $100,000 now, the income. And the reason why AMIs work like that in a place like New York City is because it's a particularly high cost housing area. And because under the HUD regulations, they recognize that you may need affordable housing for families of incomes that may seem not to be low income, even up to $100,000. Put another way, our housing market is so soul crushing that even, families earning low six figures, $100,000, can have a hard time finding housing. And so we definitely are working with our sister agency, HPD, to try to ensure that any requirements in the zoning can do better than the existing 80% AMI. We're also trying to ensure that our zoning changes help to facilitate 100% affordable projects, whether it's subsidized by HPD or other government entities, to ensure that we're hitting as low AMIs as possible when we're creating new housing across the city. Also, just on market rate housing, I hear you. I understand and I recognize the hostility towards market rate housing, but market rate housing is really important too. And I guess the briefest way to explain it is that if we had more market rate housing in Clinton Hill, and if we had more market rate housing in Fort Greene, and if we had more market rate housing in downtown Brooklyn, if we had more market rate housing in Brooklyn Heights, the rents in Crown Heights would be lower. The rents in Crown Heights have been going crazy in recent decades, and that's because there's no housing closer in for people who, would be happy to take an additional market rate unit in a Fort Greene or a Clinton Hill or something like that, but are going farther and farther out and putting a ton of pressure on existing units in neighborhoods that historically have been low income. So yes, we need to maximize the amount of affordable housing that we're producing, either mixed income housing through zoning or 100% affordable housing through subsidy programs. But we also need to make sure that the people who have money have places to go, places to live too, so that they don't necessarily need to go farther and farther and farther and farther out in Brooklyn and, take that 2-bedroom apartment at a rent that a, mother and 2 kids would never be able to afford.
Thank you, John. Let's go to Sue-Ann, and then we'll definitely get to a couple more in the chat. as well as if you have your hand raised and you can have the ability to write your question into the chat. We are collecting all of these questions and making sure that we're really thinking through the things that you're saying here. So please feel free to chat. And of course, you can also use our email address that I'll repeat at the end of the session.
Hi, thank you for taking my questions. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah, nice to see you.
So how would these proposals, in particular, I'm looking at the universal affordability preference, help to relieve pressure on some of the areas that have borne the brunt of most of the development in the last 10 years? I live in Central Brooklyn in Community Board 9, and it's the R6 and R7 mid to high density zoned areas that have seen the most development. For example, if you lived on Clarkson and Bedford in my neighborhood within a 5-block radius, you've already seen 2,500 to 3,000 units in the Flatbush area. And so how would upzoning it even further help to relieve pressure on these areas? As I see it, it would only accelerate the demolitions and the development. And if you really wanted to help these areas, it sounds like there are people in other parts of the city, the Bronx, elsewhere, that are facing this. You would let these areas downzone. And the second question is, where does local preference and local knowledge, community boards, play a role in this? Are these proposals a grab bag of ideas that you're going to let local people choose from to decide what kind of development is appropriate and where in their communities in meeting certain housing goals, which is I think what the city and some of the city council members are discussing? Or are you just going to tell every neighborhood how and where they should build based on what developers want?
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate your question. Pass it to John.
Sure. How will UAP take pressure off of Brooklyn Community District 9, like Prospect Lefferts Gardens, which is, again, another neighborhood that has been under a lot of pressure? I think it's great that we're getting questions from people in PLG or, East Flatbush, neighborhoods that have experienced a lot of pressure in recent years. UAP in particular will enable a little more in all medium and high density districts throughout the city. And what we have found in other cities, that when you loosen the zoning a little bit like that, development flows away from gentrifying areas like PLG that have borne the brunt of the housing shortage, where there's development capacity. There are still sites, but you can't build in lower density areas, you can't build in higher density areas, and so they become a real focus of development. If you enable more everywhere, then that takes some of the pressure off of neighborhoods like PLG. Also, it's worth mentioning what it does to the land market too. Right now in PLG, there's like a frenzy for sites by a lot of like big market rate like developers who are looking to build housing in some of the few places in the city where you can do that. If sites are available across a broader geography, then you wouldn't have that frenzy in PLG like you have today. And in fact, it would create a lot more opportunities for nonprofit developers, smaller developers who, may tend to build things that, you would think fit in better with the neighborhoods. It gives them a chance to work in your neighborhood instead of, the biggest players who are looking to max out the limited potential that they've gotten a hold of in that neighborhood. As far as the different proposals in different areas, the thrust of this is to enable things to happen as of right. But because we're enabling things to happen as of right, we need to pay especially close attention to the nature of those proposals. And that's why this is it's nothing like one size fits all. It's a suite of proposals that are different in different types of neighborhoods. We have our medium and high density district proposals. In low density, we have specific proposals for low density commercial districts, for large sites near transit, for 1 and 2 family districts, in a way that, like I said, we've looked to New York City's past and we've looked to other jurisdictions to see, what type of development has resulted, and what type of development is appropriate for those types of neighborhoods. And so really, we're not, intending to create dramatic change in any one place. We're trying to do a little more housing, incremental increases across the widest possible geography.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. And I do want to thank everyone who has their hand raised. A reminder, if you can have the ability to write into the Q&A function, please put your questions there. That would be really helpful. So I want to go to a couple questions that continue on the universal affordability preference. It's kind of twofold. So what would motivate a developer to build an extra 20% for affordable housing? And then also, to elaborate some more just on the AMI question, what's the AMI for those extra 20% increased restricted homes that would be part of the UAP?
Yeah, I can take the affordability levels question. So we recognize that like through AIRS, the Affordable Senior Program, that those units are defined as affordable for incomes at or below 80% AMI, so area median income. And we recognize that's like really high, like what John was saying. So like right now under 2023 AMI levels for family of 4, 80% AMI is like nearly $113,000. So we want to do better than that, and so we want to serve like a wider range of household incomes. So for UAP developments, we'll use income averaging. This means developments can rent to like a mix of households with very low AMIs and higher AMIs to balance that out. We're still talking with our counterparts at HPD, Housing Preservation Development, to determine like what AMIs those UAP units will average out to, but we think we can do a lot better than the current 80% that's required by the AIRS program. And we're looking to incorporating set-asides for voucher tenants to help address the ongoing source of income discrimination issues as well.
And we have more about this on our website as well. I know this is complicated and there's a lot of comparisons to other programs. So definitely check out our website and to get some more information on that. And we'll continue talking about it over the next couple months.
And just to do cleanup on that previous question, Lara, what would motivate people to provide 20% affordable? The answer is, a renewed tax benefit. It really underscores the necessity of a renewed tax benefit to support mixed income multifamily housing. If and when that gets renewed, then UAP has the power it can be tremendously powerful. Like when he presented during the slideshow, if UAP had been in place since 2014, we would have 20,000 more income restricted units today than we currently do. And so UAP will work for 100% affordable developments, but it's especially powerful if it can also work with mixed income developments under a renewed tax benefit.
Thank you, Winnie and John. I appreciate that. So there's a good amount of questions about short-term rentals. Can you talk about will accessory dwelling units, ADUs, be available for short-term rentals?
No, people will not be able to rent out their ADUs as a short-term rental. Existing laws regulating short-term rentals would also apply to ADUs, meaning that an entire unit cannot be used as a short-term rental. So the entire ADU could not be rented as an ADU, as a short-term rental. And there's a regulation that exists outside of zoning and is not under DCP's purview to change.
Thank you, Veronica. And just a question about ADUs again. This is definitely a hot topic that we hear loud and clear that there's a lot of questions about ADUs in the chat. Can you just elaborate on the plan to help convert illegal basements?
Yeah, so many obstacles to legalization of existing basement units are outside of DCP's authority or the scope of this text amendment. So they include things like building code or other local laws and state laws, including the multiple dwelling law if the illegal unit is located in a building with 2 or more units. So changes to these would require other action beyond this text amendment, including state action. We can only address zoning barriers, but we are trying to do everything we can to address the zoning barriers that might be faced by these illegal units. So that includes the floor area increases in the low density districts, removing the parking requirement for units would possibly help legalize some of those units. In general, our priority as the city is to ensure that people renting these units have access to safe housing. It is imperative for safety reasons to move these units out of the shadows so that they can be safely regulated.
Thank you so much. I want to recognize the time and thank you all for being with us for 2 hours of incredible conversation and great questions. Like I said, we're going to have many more opportunities to talk about all of these different topics. The next opportunity is going to be what we call the environmental scoping meeting. That will be on October 26th at 2 p.m. You can go to NYC Engage to register for that, and the link will go live. The meeting will go on as we receive more questions. So it begins at 2. Please join when you can. And just to give a little description of what environmental review is, the scoping meeting itself gives an opportunity for all of us to hear about the proposal's environmental impact. And so we use this space to provide a draft of that scope, which, as we mentioned, and John mentioned, that it was released yesterday on our website. If somebody could drop that back into the chat, that would be great. And so we review this together. We have a presentation about this, and then we discuss what should be part of the scoping determination. And that document discloses the environmental impacts and the mitigation. And so the draft scope helps in the finalized scope helps us to be able to know what we need to be studying to be able to enter into the formal review process. We'll take comment that day, and then comments will be open for 10 days following to make sure that we can hear from as many people as possible. That information will also be up on our website. So that will all be available to you. And so the questions that we receive that day will be summarized into the final scope. And then our City Planning Commission will receive that final scope, which will include responses to the comments and the transcript of all the comments. So the commission will receive all of that information from the October 26th. And again, this is a meeting to really think about, like, what are the environmental aspects that we should be thinking about as we analyze the work going ahead and the zoning proposal. So we hope to see many of you at October 26th at 2 p.m. Again, please go to our website. If somebody could drop that in the chat as well, if you haven't already. HousingOpportunity.nyc. And if you'd like to reach out to us, please use our email address at housingopportunity@planning.nyc.gov. Tonight's presentation and the recording of this will be on our website this week. I want to thank you all so much for coming. I want to thank Chair Gorodnik for joining us tonight. And especially thank you to our housing team, Veronica, Winnie, and John, for being here to answer everyone's questions. And thank you all for coming. And we look forward to the months ahead of more conversations.